Everyone, I'm going to call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 8 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Conformément à l'article 108.3h de règlement et la motion adoptée par le comité le mercredi 17 septembre 2025, le comité reprend son examen.
And it's going to resume its consideration of the Conflict of Interest Act.
Members are attending in person. I don't think we have anybody on Zoom. We will in the second hour. And I'm just going to remind everybody again about the earpieces. Make sure they're away from the microphones when you do have the floor. I'd like to welcome our first witness for the first hour today from Thurlow Law, W. Scott Thurlow, who is the founder. Mr. Thurlow, welcome to committee. You have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then it'll be followed by questions. Go ahead, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Scott Thurlow, and it is my pleasure to be here to share my views as the committee reviews the Conflict of Interest Act. At the outset, let me remind committee members that the Conflict of Interest Act is designed as a disclosure act. It places an obligation on officials to disclose their assets for conspicuous public scrutiny. The Act also places specific limitations on gifts, benefits, and creates post-employment rules. My experience with the Act is not academic, it's practical. I have had the responsibility of representing many of your colleagues as they've prepared documents to submit to the Commissioner's office. As everyone on this committee is hopefully aware, those disclosure requirements are not modest. They are also publicly disclosed. In rare cases, I have engaged directly with the Commissioner's office as it investigated potential violations of the Act and the codes which it administers. I have some practical real-world examples of changes that can be made to the Act and corresponding codes and guidelines. First, a conflict of interest rule should not compromise the democratic process. I would suggest a very modest edit to the current Act that would ensure that participating in an electoral event, provincial, municipal, territorial, is exempted from creating a conflict of interest. Running for office should be defined as the public interest. The House's Board of Internal Economy rules already limit the use of parliamentary resources in elections, and there is a decision from a former commissioner that stands for the proposition that campaigning on someone's behalf to seek support is attempting to influence an individual's decision. Well, of course it is. That's also a constitutionally protected activity. It should not come under the scrutiny of the Commissioner's office. Your constituents care about your positions on an array of issues at the heart of other elections, and there should be nothing to prevent you from telling them what you do or do not believe in. Secondly, do we really need as many different codes as we have? I mean, subtly, there are many different interpretations that distinguish the various codes from one another. This lends itself to confusion, which is perpetuated by a dueling banjos of rules for parliamentarians interpreted by different officers of Parliament. Having a consistent set of rules will help build a more consistent culture around what a conflict of interest is or is not. I have a personal pet peeve about a separate set of conflict of interest rules created by the Lobbying Commissioner, but that is a study of a different act for a different day. Speaking of which, I think all post-employment limitations should be placed in one act. You may know that there are post-employment obligations that are found in the Lobbying Act. I also don't like those limitations because they treat all designated public office holders as one giant class, which they are not. Certain aspects of those rules came to be after an order in council, which might not have been as legal as we would like. Please ask me about that. Fourth, I think that there should be clarity on the ability of members to advocate on behalf of their constituents. There is a statutory limitation on improperly, in quotes, using one's office to advance a private interest. But that is not necessarily the case for individuals who become parliamentary secretaries or ministers. I would refer to you the Commissioner's own guidance, which precludes you from, quote unquote, using your position to influence a decision to further a private interest. Advocating on behalf of a constituent's private interest should never be seen as creating a conflict. The technical language of that document needs to reflect the statutory term improperly influence. It should never be improper to advance the interests of your constituents. Personally, if I was in that position, I would wear that so-called conflict as a badge of honor. It is possible to be a member of Parliament and a minister and have a genuine tension between your roles. Just ask a transport minister who has a farm in their riding during a rail strike. That's not a conflict of interest. That's a conflict of ideas. That's what Parliament is for. Finally, I would conclude with a warning to stay away from assigning too much importance to the concept of an apparent conflict of interest. Certainly, this is at the heart of the test enshrined in the Supreme Court of Canada precedent on conflict of interest. But the appearance of a conflict is not the same as the existence of one. Certainly, this is something that public officials should be cognizant of, but it shouldn't paralyze them from doing their jobs. I can tell you from experience that a human being, a politician, a human being, waffles on the right decision because they are worried it might look bad because of some link that is so tenuous that the most hackneyed Hollywood screenwriters couldn't come up with it. People agonize over these decisions. The committee can make recommendations on the thoughtful application of that appearance of a conflict test. Wiser men and women than I have noted that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the same is true about what may or may not appear to be a conflict. I would welcome your questions, in particular about other aspects of the Act and codes which may not have been as colorfully explored by previous witnesses. I would welcome your questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thurlow. We're going to start with our first round. Mr. Barrett, going to start us off. 6 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Should designated public office holders be permitted to own assets that rest in tax havens?
So I will read into your question about whether or not designated public office holders or reporting public office holders or public office holders for that matter are able to have assets that are controlled by a blind trust. And I think the answer is resoundingly yes.
No, the question is specifically about the assets, in this case, if they're in a blind trust, being in a tax haven. So if the investment is one made in a tax haven, is that appropriate for a parliamentary secretary, a minister, a prime minister to hold their assets in tax havens?
Okay, so the first thing I would ask you is, what do you define as a tax haven? The colloquial term for that is something where taxes can be deferred to a later date when the asset is dispossessed and the gain is actually realized. Okay, another way of looking at it is a jurisdiction that has a lower rate of tax based on income or whatever the threshold test in that jurisdiction is for generating that income. Individual citizens, individual corporations should organize their affairs in a way that they seek to minimize their own taxes if that is consistent with the laws of the jurisdiction which they are operating in.
And for the people for whom this act is constructed?
So I don't see the issue. I mean, that is, I don't like the term tax haven. I think there's a pejorative aspect to it. I think it's organizing one's affairs in a way that minimizes tax.
Yeah, it certainly minimizes their payment of taxes here in Canada to support all of the things that taxes are designed to pay for. I think that when we have a government that sets policy that sees Canadians who might not have the means to afford those types of investment strategies as you've described them, that it hurts Canada when these people are supposed to be serving in the best interests of Canada, which kind of speaks to this broader question of blind trusts and whether or not we can just simply assume that everyone is operating in the best interests of Canada. We heard from the commissioner that his belief or his experience is that assets that go into the blind trust, those investments that go into the blind trust, they come out looking the same. That the trustees don't really trade, they don't really sell them, and so the decisions that those decision makers are taking can be made knowing what the impact is on specific investments. The challenge that creates for Canadians who have a cratering confidence in public institutions and public office holders is that that they believe that when they take a look at the act or it's explained to them, or we've heard many times that someone would say, I've divested all my assets. Well, that's a very cute way that it's been characterized in the act, that you can divest into a blind trust where they're likely going to just stay in the exact same form as when you put them in, as opposed to them not being sold. So it really has to do with, you came out of the gate and said that you think they're great, the blind trusts. Do you think that they do service to the improvement or improving on Canadians' confidence in elected officials, that they're acting in the best interest of the country and not the best interest of themselves, like, for example, one who would hold office while also holding their assets somewhere where they don't have to pay tax here in Canada to pay for all of the things that Canadians rely on: public health care, transportation, border security, our national police force, and so on.
So I think the first thing I would do is I take you back to your question about the tax havens and say, well, it's a good thing the last budget talked about the global minimum tax, which would do a lot to equalize that on a country by country basis. The second thing is I would actually question the underlying assumption that your question is based on, and I use what I call the soccer field and ringette arena test. And when I talk to the people that I spend time with while watching our children play sports, they don't bring this up as an issue that is of concern. Like, they have more fundamental concerns, and far be it for me to tell you what your constituents are telling you. You've got their ear at the door, absolutely. But I think if you've got a specific example of a particular trade that you think is going to create that conflict of interest, I think you're behooved to make that statement public and to put it forward.
So I guess what I'd say with my remaining time is that I have heard at the soccer fields and at the hockey rinks that people are concerned that that a prime minister who would seek to pass laws on them that would see them remit their taxes while they're struggling is also holding investments in offshore tax havens and not paying his fair share. And that does bother them. That is something that bothers them. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Barrett. Right on time, 6 minutes. We're going to keep it tight because we've got lots of questions and another panel to follow. Madame Lapointe, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Bienvenue au
Thank you
comité.
very much, and welcome to the committee. I have some questions for you. Now, you said that you didn't like the idea of apparent conflict of interest. You said that. And you didn't want that to be in the legislation. Could you tell us a little more about that? Why?
So this test is based on what I'm going to call the so-called reasonable persons test, right? And it's up to an individual who has awareness of the facts to make a determination in the place of the individual who would otherwise be making the decision. And so when I was in law school, I wrote a tongue-in-cheek essay about Sam, the reasonable man, and Samantha, the reasonable woman, who would be an officer of the court and stand in the place of the individual who was offered the opportunity to give the reasonable person test. And the issue with an appearance of a conflict of interest is that you never necessarily know what all of the variables are that are going behind the scenes when a decision is being made. Now, we heard previously that there's the potential for someone to benefit because their trust isn't really that blind and nobody ever trades any assets. That's not the point. The point is that when you are faced with a decision as a public office holder, there should not be an overt direct tension in front of you that would cause stress between your official duties and the personal interests of yourself or somebody that you know, that's related to you, or someone who would improperly benefit from that. I think it's very, very difficult to tell public office holders that they're not going to be able to make a decision because of something that's held outside of their legal control. And legal control is a very important point here, because if you are free to make your decision on behalf of the country, or on behalf of a sector of the economy. You can stand on that decision and say, here are the reasons that I made it, and I'm going to disclose that into the public record. And then you are not going to know whether or not that is going to benefit you. There's been an allegation from previous witnesses. There's been an illusion that, yeah, you actually do know. But no, it's a very bright line. And once you are a public office holder and your materials are in a blind trust, you have crossed that line and you are no longer making a decision that can legally benefit you.
Merci. On a aussi entendu le commissaire dire
We've also heard the commissioner say that he would like to see this change implemented. Do you have any comments about that?
Disagree with someone who used to be a federal court judge, who used to be the competition commissioner, who used to be the chair of the CRTC. His experience is a little bit different than mine. But I can prove a conflict of interest. I can draw a straight line between someone who gives investment advice to their sister, right? Like that's something that's provable. The appearance is not quite as provable, right? It's not something that the evidence is going to be able to be borne out very easily. The other thing that I would tell you is that in the interactions with the commissioner's office, many members have said, oh my goodness, what do you think? Is this a conflict? They give really good advice. They give sage advice to public office holders who have divined that situation thinking that there might be an issue. And I mean, I think that's sufficient. But again, if Parliament, which is supreme, Parliament wants to make that determination and implement that test into it, that's up to Parliament. I just don't think that it's needed.
aussi entendu Democracy Watch parler de
And apparently, Democracy Watch talked about 12 suggestions to improve the law. Are there any of those suggestions that you could support?
That Mr. Conacher says. So he and I have a different worldview. But the one suggestion that he has that I think will improve transparency is the ability for individuals in the public to file a complaint with the commissioner. I think that will improve public confidence in the system. But I think it's got to be more than just writing an angry letter and saying, will you investigate this MP who I didn't vote for, right? There's got to be a modicum of evidence. There's got to be some threshold of why that investigation should happen. And the other thing with those types of powers is that the commissioner has the ability to say no and give reasons for why they're not going to be pursuing that test. That rationale in the public domain is going to increase confidence in the system because someone is going to be able to make that request and then understand why that request was being denied. And then if they're friends with Mr. Conacher, he can help them sue the government, which he has done on a regular basis and sometimes quite successfully and for the improvement of the laws of Canada. There are some examples which I'm happy to talk about that because of the work that Democracy Watch has done, we have better laws in certain areas. But any decision would be reviewable by a judge based on the reasonableness standard and whether or not that decision is consistent with the decision-making rules that we have.
Thank you very much. I know that I have 30 seconds left. Okay. So, nous avons entendu le commissaire au lobby.
We heard the lobbying commissioner speak on Monday. He was talking about their post-employment limitations in the Act. Do you believe that these rules are well understood regarding what can be done and when it can be done?
I don't think they're really well understood.
Okay.
And I'm happy to go into that later again.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Thurlow. Merci, Madame Lapointe.
Merci.
Monsieur Thériault, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Thériault, you have 6 minutes. Thank you and welcome. Do you agree with me that ethics is more demanding than law? In other words, something can be legal, but that doesn't make it moral. Thank you for the question. I'd like to answer in French, but I'm not. I prefer not to answer a technical answer. I would like to prove to my daughters that I can speak some French, a little bit.
With you. I think Dr. Turnbull said the same thing in her testimony, that you can't legislate ethics. The ethics stand above what the legislation is. I would tell you that rules, and I mentioned this in my testimony, rules will often form the cultural underpinning for developing that moral compass that will guide individuals as they make those decisions. There are a lot of things that go into establishing the individual ethics and morality of individual humans. Some people have a very different prism through which they look at these things. Some of them are very matter of fact. Some of them are far more deliberate.
Est-ce à dire que
So, in other words, even if we were to change the law, or even if we were to introduce the concept of apparent conflict of interest, or it could be introduced elsewhere with control mechanisms, at that point, would you consider that the apparent appearance of conflict of interest is an important notion in ethical governance? Because from what you're saying now, it seems to completely exclude this through a legalistic vision, and therefore exclude the whole concept of apparent conflict of interest. And so we have a problem with the unusual situation in which we find ourselves now. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Maybe not as long as me, because I have another question after.
And that we always have a tension between what we can write down in a law and what the driving ethic behind those laws may be. I mean, to put it into the law means that at some step in the future, you're going to have to be able to prove it. If you're going to use that aspect of the law, you're going to have to be able to adduce evidence to suggest that something has happened. I will tell you, however, that I agree with you, that when you talk about these things in fora, particularly like this one, you are participating in that conversation that will shape and drive that discussion. The history is replete with examples where society has changed its mind because of discussions just like this one in a full, frank, and fair manner. Today, I think that creating a test on the appearance of a conflict is going to create more problems that it solves. That might not be the case in 20 years.
ce qui est visé, c'est qu'il y ait confiance?
But we want the people to trust our democratic institutions. Do you believe that the highest function involves the highest level of being exemplary? And if you say yes, because you seem to indicate that you would say yes, the unusual situation in which we find ourselves, where we have a PM with a $1 billion fund controlling 900 companies, doesn't this expose the PM to this very appearance of conflict of interest? When you see a very specific situation, you like specifics, I know. The Prime Minister has announced various projects for high-speed transportation. There's nuclear reactors in Ontario. So this is rather quick, fast-track projects. This would open a whole new market for the 3 companies on the planet who offer this type of product, one of which belongs to Brookfield. And the Prime Minister should not be benefiting Brookfield. So the so-called filters and the law regarding conflict of interest would have prevented the Prime Minister from intervening in selecting the companies among those 3. But he was not asking for a recusal from the decision, because that would give a benefit to the whole sector, even if there are very few players here. So is this to be considered no conflict of interest because it's general? Because really, from a strictly appearance point of view, we should be questioning this. But the current filters, or the filter in question, does not allow for that kind of control. We're not talking about just anybody. We're not talking about a simple minister. We're talking about the Prime Minister, who is deciding everything when it comes to economic orientations. So what is to be done if we can't change the law? How can we introduce mechanisms that would be equal to the ethical criteria that you claim to share with me?
Super quickly.
45 seconds.
Street. So there are government decisions that, based on the portfolio that the Prime Minister had, the investments that he had, would be disadvantaged, right? The government's work on the electric vehicle mandate, for example, suspending that would not help his shares in Tesla. The second thing that I would say is that you are yourself doing the exact work that we need to advance that. As a parliamentarian, you're pointing it out and you're putting it into the public domain. You're allowing for individual Canadians to examine the arguments that you're putting forward and making their decision on that, and they will have the opportunity to make that choice in the next election.
Thank you, Mr. Thurlow. Merci, Monsieur Theriault. That completes our first round. We're going to go to our second round now. And Mr. Cooper, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the witness, would you support amending the Conflict of Interest Act to provide for an enforceable general anti-avoidance measure so that anyone who circumvents the act by exploiting a technical loophole or concocts a scheme to get around the act and its application entirely could be held accountable?
So GAR rules are in place in many other statutes in Canada, starting with the most important one, which is the Income Tax Act of Canada. Okay, so those types of rules have been used effectively to do exactly what you are looking to do, which is to avoid the ability for individuals to design legal mechanisms to avoid taxation. Now, avoiding taxation and delaying taxation are two very, very different things. So now in this particular case, if someone is creating a construct that would allow them to advance a private interest, I think this goes back to the question from Mr. Theriault. Like, that's an ethical question, not a legal one. It would be interesting to see what that rule looked like. Certainly, I would be happy to comment on a rule once it's been designed. But a general anti-avoidance rule in this area, I think, undermines the whole purpose of the Act. Like, anyone who's willing to design that kind of a tool to avoid the application of the Act, they're going to find another way around it.
Cite one example. It's one we faced last fall when Mark Carney, before he became Canada's most conflicted prime minister, was appointed as, for all intents and purposes, Justin Trudeau's economic advisor. Now, as the prime minister's advisor, Mr. Carney should have been subject to the Conflict of Interest Act. However, Mr. Carney and Mr. Trudeau effectively cooked up a scheme whereby Mark Carney was not technically in the PMO, but instead supposedly housed in the Liberal Party as the so-called chair of the Liberal Party's task force on economic growth, as it turned out to be nothing more than a one-man task force. Mr. Carney, also that Mr. Carney could avoid accountability, skirt the law by getting around the Conflict of Interest Act, and hide his multitude of conflicts of interest from Canadians. It was a complete and utter sham. Everyone knew that Mr. Carney was advising Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau even bragged about the fact that his economic advisor was none other than Mark Carney, and yet Mr. Carney was circumventing the Conflict of Interest Act. Do you not see a problem with that scenario?
So the Conflict of Interest Act applies to people who are actually in office. So if that was an actual office that was paid for by the Crown, I think we'd be talking about
it would
something
apply
very
to
different.
an aid to the Prime Minister. It would apply to a ministerial aid. It would apply to a
they're
ministerial advisor. Mark Carney
they're
was effectively
employees.
in that role, but yet he was able to avoid the Conflict of Interest Act. Hence the need for some sort of mechanism to address it, in my view.
Okay, so the Act applies to public office holders, and it applies, the various codes apply to the individuals who are governed by the code.
The whole point, and the whole point is to address those who are taking advantage of a loophole. Here you have the CEO of a $1 trillion investment firm advising the Prime Minister, someone who has all sorts of conflicts of interest, and yet was able to get around the Act. Yet, had he been in the PMO doing exactly the same thing that he was doing outside of the PMO, he would have been subject to the Act.
So I'll say two things in reply. The first thing I'll say is you're quite right to make these concerns known if you think that they are important to you and your constituents. I think that things that happened in September 2024 had a pretty good litmus test subsequent to that. So you say that this was something that was common knowledge and everybody knew it. Well, if it was common knowledge and everybody knew it, I guess that factored into some decisions that people made at a later date. The second thing that I would say is there's a difference between going around something and having it not apply to you at all. And I think that it would not be a good idea to have an act apply to people who are not in the public service. Okay, so you may call it a circumvention, but the threshold is whether or not they are in the public service. Now, I am not privileged to any information that may have been shared between the two individuals that you mentioned, but certainly there are other people in that office.
10 seconds, Mr. Thurlow,
Other
please.
people in that office who understood what those arrangements were. I go back to the comment made by Mr. Theriault. It's about what the moral compass for those individuals is.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Ms. Church, 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Thurlow, thank you for appearing today, and thank you for your commentary around, or your advice on not placing a great weight on apparent conflicts of interest. I just think it's so important in the world we're in right now that we are able to see that for what it is and cut through baseless allegations, cut through the weaponization of misinformation and the peddling or even the creation of conspiracy theories for an ill purpose. I think we have to be very careful of that as parliamentarians. So let me just pull you back onto the topic of this review in the Act and maybe back to where my colleague left off around post-employment limitations. She was questioning you about whether or not the rules are well understood. I'd ask you to pick up there, and also you had mentioned that you thought that DPOH rules, designated public office holders, the rules applying to them are currently unconstitutional. Can you tell me more about that?
So I'll start with that one. And I'm not sure it was inadvertent, but it happened. And so by way of an order in council, the Crown made all parliamentarians, senators, and members of parliament designated public office holders. In so doing, they limited the rights of parliamentarians post their employment. That's not the way this is supposed to work. Parliament limits the Crown, not the other way around. The application of the law to the Crown comes from this rule called the Magna Carta. I wasn't around when it was started, but that was the first document that was advanced to say, no. The Commons are, the Parliament is supreme. Can Parliament fix this? Absolutely, Parliament can fix this. If you make the amendment as parliamentarians to bind parliamentarians, that's perfectly fine. A future Parliament could review that change, but having it done by the Crown didn't sit right with me, okay? Now, are the rules well understood? I learn on a regular basis how little the rules are understood. And it's not because they're not conspicuous. They are very conspicuous. The lobbying commissioner does a great job, actually, of educating public office or designated public office holders about what their obligations are. They're very, very, very good at that. But again, like, there are rules for reporting public office holders. There are rules for other public, there's so many different rules for post-employment. The other thing I would point out is the designated public office holder class is extremely broad, and it includes someone who works in a minister's office and equates with them at the same level as the prime minister. That's ridiculous, okay? There's absolutely no good reason that we have that scale. We have many other different sliding scales that we should apply. This punishes young people more than it punishes ministers and prime ministers. This is something that should be re-examined and taken a closer look at. Again, that's another act, but my position would be all of the post-employment rules should be in one place, not scattered amongst various public office or parliament officers of parliament.
Thank you. We've heard some witnesses say that they find that violations of the Act are a mere slap on the wrist. What do you think about that view?
Until they get to the door and they're knocking on the door. I have seen many an ad, some in my social media feed, that point out who has violated the conflict of interest rules and who has not. You can't have it both ways. It can't be a slap on the wrist and simultaneously something that can be used to political advantage to have someone go after the office. I've heard that, this is something that people aren't taking seriously and, they don't really worry about it. I don't think that's true. The parliamentarians that I talk to, they are very vigilant about how they make their submissions to the conflict of interest officer. Like, you can see very conspicuously on the website who has done it, who has not, who has been given an AMP. I don't think that's a slap on the wrist. I think that's an invitation to their opponents in the next election to point to it.
Now, you bring a wealth of experience having advised parliamentarians, having worked with the ethics and lobbying commissioners. What do you think of the view that these offices should be brought under a single office?
So I'm very selfish, and I would not want that because they do very different things. One of them gets very much into the nitty-gritty of the individual backgrounds of all of the people in senior public office. They offer advice about very specific things. The lobbying commissioner is responsible for a registry of the people who are communicating with the government, and when they communicate with the government and how they communicate with the government. They're not regulators. They're not designed to be regulators. They were never designed to be regulators. They are there to encourage public disclosure and allow for people to know who's talking to who. I think they're very, very different jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Thurlow. Ms. Church. Mr. Theriault, 5 minutes. Okay.
Mr. Theriault, you have 5 minutes. Well, maybe there's a difference in terms of the introduction of appearance of conflict of interest. In terms of the notion of conflict of interest, right now, Section 2 says that personal interest does not target interest in a matter of a general business decision affecting the public office holder being part of a vast category of individuals. One witness told us that according to that definition, the Prime Minister would not have to recuse himself in 99% of decisions. And even the Ethics Commissioner said the same thing when I was asking for an answer as to how we could increase standards. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that you have a politician's profile that has nothing to do with the profile of a politician that was part of revising the Act in 2013. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Do we have to extend the definition? Do we have to broaden it? I have other examples that I can give you. Again, from the point of view that we must make sure that citizens have trust in our democratic institutions.
I think at a very high level, I agree with you. I think that the rule of general application is one where it is very easy for people of means who are sitting in Parliament to get an even greater benefit. So, and I will make this example up, like someone who has $1 billion wealth fund, they vote on a capital gains tax that would apply to everyone, and that change drew that tax liability down. That would be a very material advantage, but it applies to everyone. Now, the problem with the position that you're advancing is, well, if we don't have a general application rule, will parliamentarians ever be able to vote on anything? Where do we draw this line between what is something that is in front of Parliament and is important for the country to keep going? Like, and we could get into NAFTA, or sorry, CUSMA or USMACA, depending on what you call it. Like, there are so many other things that an individual's past performance or past experience is going to have an impact on. It's very difficult to narrow the rule of general application. So again, like, I would invite you to make a suggestion and say, here is the proposal that I would make.
In the example raised just a few minutes ago, Parliament passed a law on a minimum global tax, and that meant that multinationals would have to pay at least 15%. During the G7 meeting, In June, the Prime Minister announced that income earned by U.S. subsidiaries would be exempt. And he made that decision. 7 months earlier, the PM, who was Mark Carney, an individual who was running Brookfield, moved his company and the tax residents of his company to New York. So even if his decision to exempt active companies in Canada and being domiciled in the U.S. was a general measure, it seemed to be custom-made for Brookfield. So perhaps a Canadian taxpayer could benefit from this, but you can't be blind to the fact that even if it wasn't in his blind trust, how much was it going to increase his fortune? He knows that it's going to increase his fortune, even if he doesn't know by how much. So what I'm saying seems to me to be something that should lead us to try to find a solution to this very unusual case, because it's the first, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the last. Aren't you worried, ethically speaking?
And the reason it doesn't is because when the Prime Minister made that decision, when the Prime Minister talked about that at the OECD, we were in the process of talking to Americans about our ongoing trade relationship with them.
Ça, c'est votre interprétation politique.
That's your political interpretation. I am not reading anything about why he did it. I know that his position led him to make this kind of decision in given situations, and in that respect, an anti-conflict of interest filter managed by an employee who's his chief of staff is insufficient. Do you agree with that?
Very quick response to Mr. Theriault.
Mr. Conacher made the same accusation about people who are beholden to the Prime Minister. I would just say, look at the last couple parliaments. We had all kinds of people who were, quote unquote, beholden to prime ministers who stood up to them, some in very famous situations.
Okay.
I don't share your concern.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur Theriault.
Thank you, Mr. Theriault.
Minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. The Ethics Commissioner has said that transparency is the cornerstone of the Act. I imagine you'd agree. And in an August 8th piece, you had remarked that a successful business person usually has a very long memory. I'd have to agree. It's part of the job, right? When the Prime Minister set up his blind trust, he would probably remember what went into it, right? Sure. The full details of the portfolio, the mix, the kind of long-term funds, the major priorities, wherever he might be most leveraged. He would have a pretty serious sense of that, right?
One would presume. I actually phoned some people and said they should emulate the investment decisions. They were pretty good investments. It's a very significant portfolio.
Emulate the decisions because they know that he's on the inside of the take on these decisions, right?
I would say that is an allegation. I wouldn't repeat it.
Well, you did here. Let me ask the second kind of question here. Now, 99% of the decisions that the Prime Minister makes aren't subject to conflict of interest laws. He refuses to discuss and disclose the assets of the fund that he had established in the investment world prior to becoming Prime Minister. And he would cash in on nearly 100 conflicts of interest. That means he could profit from almost 100 potential conflicts. So any gains in that fund would translate directly into personal profits for the Prime Minister, right?
So I am more inclined to believe Dr. Turnbull, who said it is much more likely that he's leaving money on the table by leaving the private sector that he was in. And that is the hook that's important here. We're trying to encourage the best and the brightest to become parliamentarians, to put their names forward, to be part of this decision-making body. We want to encourage them to seek public office and to give their wealth of experience to Canadians.
So
I don't think it's fair for allegations like the ones that you're making when we have a legal mechanism in place where the trustee who is responsible for those assets can take actions independent of the Prime Minister's decisions.
So I don't see public service as something that comes down from the mount. I see it as something that you serve from the bottom up. So we might have a very philosophically different idea of what it means to be a public servant. In order to serve, you have to be clean, you have to be ethics compliant, you have to be completely open and transparent, as is the principle of the act that the Ethics Commissioner has described. So let me ask this, in that spirit of transparency, to make sure that as public servants, public office holders are serving their people, does the public have any way of knowing how the Prime Minister's decisions are impartial?
So this is a philosophical question about the difference between trust and efficacy. Both of these things can be true at the same time. The public, based on the debates in Parliament, based on the things that we are saying here at this committee, the public can make that decision based on the things that we are all saying and the evidence which we are proposing be put for them.
So in that spirit, sir, in that spirit, if I may, with the time that I have with you, Canadians don't get to know when his so-called ethics screen is triggered. They don't know. We don't know if the decisions he's making are actually benefiting the country or his private fund and his private interests. They can't tell the difference when he's acting for himself versus serving the country. That lack of transparency, that inability to understand and discern when is Mark Carney making decisions for the country with the investment people he's talking to going to profit himself or come to the benefit of the country. That cloud of darkness creates massive issues. And this is backed up by what the conversation I had with Mr. Conacher in the last committee session here. Do you not see a problem with this?
So if you have any actual examples where you think that tension exists, I suggest that you put them on the table. I don't believe that Canadians see it through the same prism that you do, but it is entirely within your rights to adduce that evidence here and allow for people to be informed by it.
Well, you know, as we see the meetings that the Prime Minister had in New York and in Washington, we already know there are conflicts with funds that he has invested in and the money managers he met in the United States. I don't know if he's acting in the interest of the country or himself. And because of that cloud of that failure to have transparency around how he governs his decisions, on behalf of the 100,000 plus Canadians I represent from Calgary Heritage, I'd say there's some serious problems.
I have no evidence that he still holds those funds.
Okay.
That's the whole purpose of the blind trust.
Thank you, Mr. Thurlow, Mr. Majumdar, Mr. Sally. Tu vas partager ton temps avec
You're going to be sharing your time? Thank you. 5 minutes total. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Thurlow, for being with us, and thank you very much for your most interesting and enriching answers. I'd like to share a point of view with you before I ask my question. Before beginning my political career in 2017, I was very hesitant. I was in a completely different field, and I wondered whether I should make the leap. And I would say that anybody would have that hesitation for a number of reasons, because there are all kinds of constraints. It's not an easy world. So I'd like to hear your point of view about the system that could be more restrictive, such as the one which would oblige a public office holder to sell their assets to avoid any conflict of interest. Do you think that this would be a disincentive to competent people who have an attractive career? And would this be a disincentive to running for office?
Consistent with the questions that Mr. Majumdar was asking. It's not about coming down from the mountain to serve the great public. It's about there being a disincentive to doing so, whether it's up or down. Okay, it could be as simple as a member who's part of a union and no longer would have access to pension benefits because they came to the House of Commons and they would be stepping away from the work that they're doing. We don't want to see people being forced to make decisions of divestiture, even with the tax exemptions that the Conflict of Interest Commissioner talked about, which I found was very interesting. Like, that's a good point. It's a good way of looking at it. But ultimately, these people will have sometimes more than just a business interest. Sometimes it's an emotional tie.
Exactement. Mais j'aimerais peut-être poser une question.
Exactly. But I'd like to ask perhaps a more constructive question to see how we could improve this. There is no such thing as a perfect system. There's no perfect law. So I would like to have your opinion. What do you think of harmonizing the Conflict of Interest Act and the code and the act? The parliamentarians' code. What do you think?
Said earlier, I think we should do everything in our power to have one set of rules so that there isn't the opportunity for misinterpretation between the various officers, and that includes the Senate side as well. Like, there are good reasons that they're divorced, but there are competing interpretations that are coming to fore.
2 minutes and 20 seconds, Mr. Saini. Go ahead.
We heard that the public holders should be forced to sell their assets to avoid conflict. Does that not preclude a lot of people who have good strength in running the country and the finance, if that was the case?
I would not suggest that people have to divest their asset. I mean, your home for most Canadians is their biggest asset. That's how you get tied to your constituency. You don't want people selling their homes. I think that is something that is a disincentive to the public service. And if I could just kind of focus this on trust in public office holders. I, as a Canadian, trust the people who are given these opportunities and these privileges to do the quote-unquote moral and ethical thing, to use Mr. Theriault's words. That's what our system is based on. Our entire system of laws is about individuals that we invest that trust into. I understand that there's cynicism that sometimes is used for political gain. That is 100% fair ball. If that is how you want to go after your opponents, you absolutely can. I choose not to do that. I invest trust in these people because they have stepped forward to swear or sign an oath, depending on who they are, and they sign an oath as a minister to be loyal to the Crown. That oath is what we should be placing our faith in.
Are there any changes to our ethical legal framework you believe should be implemented, whether it be the Act or the Code?
So, as I suggested, I think there really needs to be the emphasis has to be placed on what is an improper use of that authority. Okay? As I said, parliamentary secretaries and ministers, they have that interest of their constituents that they themselves aren't necessarily always able to defend. I think that that's inappropriate. I think that parliamentarians should be able to do that work, and that language that currently exists on the Commissioner's website needs to be strengthened. I have been very consistent in saying that the laws that we have are ones that create trust in the citizenship. I think that we have to invest trust into individuals, and I mean, I'm not in a position to criticize the people who are part of that matrix right now. I, as a Canadian, I invest that trust into them.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Theriault. I want to thank you for your testimony today in front of the committee. This concludes our first hour. We're going to reset, make sure the witness that's online is ready to go. We're going to suspend for a few minutes, and we'll be back soon. The second hour, we have two individuals who are appearing. First of all, Mr. Gregory J. Levine, who's lawyer and ethics consultant, social scientist. So welcome, Mr. Levine. And Mr. Guy Giorno, who is appearing as an individual. And Mr. Giorno is a lawyer. So we're going to start with you, Mr. Levine, if you're okay, for 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, sir.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts about the Conflict of Interest Act. As mentioned, I'm a semi-retired lawyer interested in administrative, municipal, and ethics law. I've been in government ethics law, interested in it for over 30 years. I've worked in various capacities, including being a general counsel to a provincial ombuds and being a municipal integrity commissioner for several municipalities. I've also appeared on policy panels for one federal and two municipal commissions of inquiry regarding ethics matter, and I've written a certain amount of stuff on this topic. I've also had, and I mentioned this sort of tangentially, a very extended period over the last many years as a caregiver. There are many elements of care, of course, compassion, love, dedication. But one aspect I'd like to mention is respect. Interestingly, the idea of respect permeates much of ethical discussion and practice. Professor Green has already indicated in his presentation to this committee how the ethic of mutual respect is foundational to democracy. Through respect, we hear the concerns of others, listen to their arguments, understand their interests, and arrive at equitable and fair solutions. Government ethics have established rules which help us, which guide us in respecting our polity and our need for fair, unbiased, and publicly responsible decision-making. The Conflict of Interest Act is one such set of rules. I can't articulate all that this act does, but would like to just mention a few issues, some very broad, before for the rest of my few minutes. Conceptually, the act changes traditional approaches to conflict of interest in that it treats conflict itself as a problem. The common law view was that conflict should be disclosed and that the person with a conflict would not participate in decisions respecting matters which could further his or her private interest. Public duty was seen to clash with private interest, but conflict of interest was a precondition, a state of interestedness, which if not disclosed, not subject to withdrawal from participation, could lead to corruption or biased decision-making. Conflict of interest is not corruption, and they should not be seen as the same. One is a possible precondition to the other. Private interests are important. Traditionally, the common law and then the first regulation of conflicts focused on monetary and pecuniary interests. This is not because financial interests, however described, are the most important interests, but because they are the most easily quantifiable in ostensibly objective terms. Emotional or psychological and relational interests, though, are powerful and important and can affect decision making. And finally, I have several other points, but I'm just going to mention appearances. Appearances, too, can be important. Apparent conflict of interest is different from reasonable apprehension of bias. I've used in my little description here a definition from BC's Members Conflict of Interest Act. It says an apparent conflict occurs if there is a reasonable perception, which is reasonably well-informed, a reasonably well-informed person could properly have, that the member's ability to exercise an official power or perform an official duty must have been affected by the member's private interest. This has to be an objective interest at stake, not merely a sense that there must be some interest. There are numerous rules, and I know the issue of divestments come up, so I expect it will, and similarly, the conflict screens. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Levine. Short of time, I like that. Gives more opportunity for questions. It's perfect. Mr. Giorno, 5 minutes to address the committee, sir. Go ahead.
Good evening. As the chair said, my name is Guy Giorno. I'm a partner in Canada's largest law firm, Fasken, where I lead the political law practice, which covers lobbying, legal compliance, conflict of interest, accountability and transparency laws, campaign finance, parliamentary investigations, and more. I'm an adjunct professor at Carleton University teaching the course Ethics and Political Management. I currently serve as the appointed Integrity Commissioner of 20 municipalities in Ontario. As a part-time Integrity Commissioner, I am no longer active in partisan politics. I used to chair the Law of Lobbying and Ethics Committee of the Canadian Bar Association and was twice elected to the board of the Council on Governmental Ethics Laws, which is the preeminent organization of North American government ethics administrators. I appear this evening in a personal capacity. These opinions don't reflect the views of my law firm, its clients, any municipality, the university, or any other individual or entity except me. This evening, I offer two recommendations. First, most of the Conflict of Interest Act is toothless. Most of its rules, in fact, all its important rules, aren't backed by penalties, and that has to change. Second, several key provisions of a document called Open and Accountable Government, which is just a policy statement, not a law, should be moved into the Conflict of Interest Act. As you'll be aware, the Act replaced a code of conduct that, in its most recognizable form, dates back to Prime Minister Chrétien and before him Prime Minister Mulroney. The code, through successive prime ministers, was merely a guideline. The advantage of a law over a guideline is that a law has teeth. Break the law, and one can be charged, convicted, fined, imprisoned. But that's not what happened. For the most part, the Act is no more enforceable than the codes it replaced. There are 55 separate rules in the Conflict of Interest Act. Only 15 of them, the most minor 15, carry penalties. The 55 rules can be divided into 31 prohibitions, things you shall not do, and 24 duties, things you must do. Almost all the important rules are among the 31 prohibitions, and none carries a penalty. 9 of the duties, the most important 9 duties, also carry no penalty. Can't be fined for breaching them, can't go to jail. In total, 40 out of 55 rules with no penalties. Examples. Section 33, a former public office holder shall not take improper advantage of previous public office. Sections 8 and 9. Officials shall not use their positions or their influence to further their private interests or those of their relatives or friends. Section 21, mandatory recusal from any decision, discussion, debate, or vote where the official would be in a conflict of interest. Break these rules, and 36 more of them, and nobody gets charged or fined or goes to jail. The worst that can happen, somebody can get written up, named in a report. In theory, an official can be dismissed from office, but by my count, in 18 and a half years, that has happened never. Fines only apply to making financial disclosures to the commissioner. Miss a financial disclosure and you could be fined up to $500. Now, the commissioner is recommending a 6-fold increase in the maximum fine for these minor infractions, from $500 to $3,000. In my respectful submission, that one-off change is unhelpful. You can make the penalties for minor infractions 6,000 times bigger, but as long as officials can get away with breaking the 40 most important rules, fiddling with the minor rules actually makes things worse. Worse because it sends a message that the big rules aren't taken seriously and get to be ignored. Second, adding things into the Act. I mentioned the old Code of Conduct. Most of the old code ended up in the Act, but a small portion of it found its way into a document which under Mr. Harper was called Accountable Government, and under Mr. Trudeau and now Mr. Carney is called Open and Accountable Government. There, the content was combined with other expectations, and all of it is not a law, just a bunch of guidelines. Two significant later additions made their way into these guidelines. Mr. Harper added a section to prevent government business from being mingled or commingled with partisan fundraising. It is called Annex B, Fundraising and Dealing with Lobbyists, Best Practices for Ministers and Parliamentary Secretaries. And Mr. Trudeau added the very important Annex I, the Code of Conduct for Ministerial Exempt Staff. In my view, those two annexes, Annex B and Annex I, are so important that they need to be put somewhere with teeth, which they don't have now. So I would take them, import them into the Code of Conduct, along with any other provisions of the document, Open and Accountable Government, that belong in a law, not just in a policy statement. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Giorno. Mr. Barrett, 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Giorno, would you agree that banning ministers from holding assets in tax haven jurisdictions is a simple but effective way to strengthen Canadians' trust that ministers and the Prime Minister aren't hiding conflicts in conflicts of interest offshore?
I'm not sure how simple it is, but there are some things that we get done. So first of all, I would, it's easy to legislate that people who are public office holders, and we're talking about only 3,000 people or fewer, should be residents of Canada, so they can't take advantage of residing somewhere else. And then as long as they can't be operating a company, or at least a reporting public office holder is not permitted by law to operate a company or a business. They should be running businesses that are operating in tax havens. Beyond that, with a definition that should be workable. I'll note that it's very important to ensure that our reporting public office holders have investments in places where there is transparency and disclosure. And if one of the attributes we know as a tax haven is there's no transparency and no disclosure, it actually frustrates the work of the Act and the Commission in enforcing the Act.
If senior staff for these public office holders have to publicly disclose their finances, why shouldn't, or I guess I could ask, should that same transparency apply to party leaders and leadership candidates who seek to govern the country? And let me add a bit of a precision here. When I talk about party leaders, in elections in recent years, to earn a seat on the debate stage, for example, that's been confined to people who are reasonably expected to hold official party status, have seats in the House of Commons. So for the sake of this conversation, let's not just say anyone who is defined as a party, but a party who might hold seats in the House of Commons, the leader of a party who might reasonably be expected to elect members to the House.
So that's a legitimate policy suggestion. I don't actually have a view on that. I do note that it raises the question of who will regulate it, whether it will be the regulator of our elections, or the Chief Electoral Officer, or the regulator of this Act. But it's certainly open for discussion to expand the scope of people who are made to disclose, for sure.
So the Act defines divestment to include keeping assets in a blind trust. It's a loophole. I don't think for a second that when Canadians hear that someone says, well, I've divested my assets, so the question of conflicts of interest, the questions of transparency have all been answered. Isn't it time that we require that the Prime Minister and party leaders fully sell controlled assets within 30 days of taking office? So we're being specific here. We're not talking about their home, but controlled assets.
That again, Chair, is a policy proposal. It's certainly worthy of discussion. I'll simply note the following things: that the member's right, divestment is defined to include not divestment. which is a challenge. The second thing is the Commissioner has told us that the assets in these blind trusts are not mixing or churning the way one would expect them to, which does create a problem that people then know what's in their blind trust when the whole purpose of the trust is they're not supposed to. And I'll add that I do agree with the Commissioner that if there is to be mandatory real divestment, not blind trusts, that a solution would be to offset or compensate public office holders so they're made whole. I mean, the taxes on capital gains go to the Crown anyway, so the Crown can easily forego those for the sake of making the Conflict of Interest Act work if that's what Parliament decides is necessary.
And there are currently costs that go with the management of blind trust as well. Who pays to manage the trust?
The Crown.
You talked about the Act being, quote, toothless. So if we were to make if we were to give it real teeth by allowing meaningful fines, and you did speak to some of what you thought was material or immaterial in terms of amounts, and you referenced jail time. You said there's no one's getting arrested, no one's paying fines. Would $10,000 fines for serious ethical breaches, instead of just limiting penalties to paperwork errors, do you think that would serve as sufficient deterrent for the people who'd hold these offices?
No, I think that making something an offense and allowing for prosecution and conviction by the courts with real fines or imprisonment is the way to do it. But I'll add that, Chair, in response to the question, I have to say that may mean that some things go out of the law. The problem with making this an act and not having penalties is that you're actually giving the illusion that it means something, right? Every other time, most of the times Parliament enacts something, it adds penalties. We have laws that govern marine transportation, our railways, our airports, our customs and all that. And generally when Parliament legislates, those who break the rules are subject to either administrative monetary penalties or most often prosecution and real penalties. The problem with this act is it's kind of illusory. It looks like it means something because it's in an act, but it's not there. So the answer to the question is I think there should be real penalties, including the possibility of jail time, but that may mean that some rules have to be stripped out of the act if they are the kind of rules that ought not to be amenable to those harsher consequences.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Giron. Monsieur Sarret, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. And thanks to both of you for being here with us this afternoon. Mr. Giorno, you heard, I believe, Mr. Thurlow say that the appearance of conflict of interest should not be included in a law. Do you agree with that or not?
Don't agree that the appearance of conflict can be ignored. I just tie back to what I said a second ago, Chair. Whether that is something that should subject somebody to imprisonment is a different story, a harsh penalty. But the reality is one of the real reasons we have this act and we had the codes before it is because there was an understanding not just that there must be integrity in our public institutions or national institutions, but that Canadians must be able to have confidence that there is that integrity. So perception is not just window dressing. Perception is substantively important to the future of our institutions because public confidence is essential to their continuation.
OK. Et j'aimerais aussi parler de la...
I'd like to address the last parliamentary session. There was an idea that Parliament, generally speaking, should pull together functions such that of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner and the Lobbying Commissioner and have them pool together in the same office. What do you think of that idea?
I don't agree with it either. I think they're regulating different people. One's regulating the private sector. One's regulating public office holders. Already the commissioner has pooled responsibility for different public office holders, members of Parliament, for example, and then the POHs and reporting public office holders under the code. I think there's scope to maybe expand the public sector reach, but I don't think it's good policy to have the same regulator regulate the private and the public sector at the same time.
Tout à l'heure, j'avais posé une question à M. Thurlow, mais j'aimerais bien la reposer.
I have a question for Mr. which I'd asked of Mr. Thurlow, but I'd like to ask you the same question. A restrictive measure which would oblige a public office holder to sell their assets Well, the goal of that would be to avoid the appearance or the actual conflict of interest. Could this be a disincentive to people, preventing them from wanting to run in elections? And would this be a constraint to having talent on the political scene?
It might be. I mean, my answer, Chair, is that I believe we should not structure our rules to turn people away or to encourage them. We should simply structure our rules to ensure that there is accountability, integrity, and transparency in the operation of government. So I think it's a legitimate concern, and I wouldn't bend the rules to let more people in or bend the rules to keep people out. I do agree that's a significant factor.
Merci, mais je profiterai.
Thank you. I'd like to take advantage of the opportunity of having you here with us, Mr. Journo, to share a point of view with you, which was expressed by my conservative colleagues. They said that they felt it was inappropriate for a Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council to not be included in the review mechanism. And the mechanism I'm referring to is the ethical review, which applies to the Prime Minister. So you were the PM's Chief of Staff. At the time when you held that role, did you have any shortcomings in terms of your declarations regarding ethics issues?
I want to make sure, Chair, that I understand the question correctly. Is the member referring to screens?
Avez-vous fait une déclaration par rapport?
Did you make any statement about the ethical issues as a Chief of Staff?
Again,
are you referring to Mr. Giorno's personal investments, or as it related to his role
Parce qu'il y a eu une
as...
déclaration d'intérêt, tout simplement.
Did you
Was there a declaration of interest?
Declare a conflict of interest in anything?
So the answer, thank you, Chair, is no. My holdings were modest at the time. They were in RSPs only. I declared them to the Commissioner according to the law. I did not have any other active interests. I'd resigned from my law partnership, as was anyway required by the Act. So I didn't personally have them. If it's helpful, my predecessor, my successor, Nigel Wright, did have an extensive screen with the.
Mais je voulais pas savoir ce que vous aviez des actifs ou pas. Est-ce que vous avez?
I didn't want to know whether or not you had any assets. I want to know whether you made a conflict of interest declaration. Did you fill out a form?
I did, Chair. Yes, repeatedly. It was an annual, and every time my investments changed, I had to file again. So every month, I would send my RSP statement to the Commissioner's office.
Vous aussi, vous aviez des investissements.
And you also had investments as Chief of Staff at the time.
Okay.
But Chair, they were the kind that RSPs are not controlled investments, so I was allowed to keep them.
Tout à fait, merci beaucoup. C'est ce que je voulais savoir.
That's correct. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to know.
Sarré,
Thank you, Mr. Sarré. Mr. Theriault, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Mr. Journo, and welcome as well, Mr. Levine. I'd like to address both of you, and I'll try to be brief. I'm reassured to see you say that the appearance of a conflict of interest should be considered in the wording of the law, because, after all, the issue here is implicit appearance of conflict of interest versus appearance of explicit conflict of interest. In other words, do we have to write it explicitly or not in the Act? When there is an appearance of conflict of interest, it will likely sometimes lead to an inquiry because of the appearance. There has to be an appearance of conflict of interest for the Ethics Commissioner to say, oh, we hadn't seen that, and they'll conduct an inquiry to see whether, in fact, there has been a conflict of interest. But what we're trying to do here is introducing it explicitly. Could that lead us to implement mechanisms by which to better administer the appearance of conflict of interest so that we don't find ourselves in an objective conflict of interest situation? What do you think of this reasoning?
I'm not as Chair. I don't agree with those who are worried about the what can happen if apparent conflict or perceived conflict is regulated. It's based on a well-established, like hundreds of years, legal principle based on what a reasonable person, fully apprised of all the facts, would think. And we have, unlike the municipal level in Ontario, at the federal level, our commissioners are all lawyers and they're trained in this. This is applying a fairly standard, centuries-tested legal test to determine what a reasonable person would perceive. I think that would actually be, in the long run, beneficial and more helpful to address these perceived problems as well as substantial ones. And I do agree that by dealing with the perception, you can actually reduce the frequency of the actual.
May I comment?
Oui, Monsieur Levin, c'est à vous.
Yes, Mr. Levine. Yes, Mr. Levine, go ahead.
Eh bien, moi, conflict of interest in the act, and I would suggest, if it's of interest, that you look at BC's statute, the Members' Conflict of Interest Act, Section 2, because it has an explicit rule about apparent conflict of interest, and it's one of actually the few statutes across the country that does, and it's had commissioners' reports on it and how it works. So I would particularly reports by former Commissioner Oliver and Fraser in BC, and I would suggest making use of that knowledge.
Merci.
Thank you. What do you think of the conflict of interest screens managed by subordinates of the PM in the current case? But if it weren't the PM, it could be a minister, but it would be people reporting to him. What do you think of that? And how, in this unusual situation in which we find ourselves with the Prime Minister, how could we make the process more transparent? And how could we make it work in a less suspect fashion? Mr. Levine, for you.
Thank you. I am a bit mystified by screens, actually, as I'm sure many of us are. I understand the commissioner has used them and has found authority to use them, or at least his authority has been upheld by the Federal Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal of that. But I'm troubled by them because there are no, first, the authority under which it's based is Section 29 of the Members' Conflict of Interest Act. That is just a general statement about finding measures to help people comply. I think if you want screens, you should put them explicitly in the statute so that we know what they are and how they're to operate. It's kind of an irony, because if you believe blind trusts work, why would you need the screen? And I know it's sort of saying they don't, so you have to have some other mechanism to allow people to recuse themselves, or to someone else to essentially mask the fact that there is a conflict. Anyway.
Monsieur Giorno, là-dessus.
Mr. Giorno?
Is that screens, which used to be called walls, in fact, at a time where, they were called walls, named after a very large wall in China. Now, the more favored language is to call them a screen, have been observed for decades in governments and in the private sector. So in the private sector, accounting firms, law firms, even lobbying firms use these walls or screens to ensure that there is integrity, where people who are not supposed to be seeing files don't see them. It's been widely observed in governments. It is absolutely a thing, and the reason I am saying it, that is, I favor this, is because something I said previously. We should be, in my view.
Mais est-ce qu'il devrait être opéré? Excusez-moi. Est-ce qu'il devrait être?
But should this be should these screens be run or operated by the employees? Because right now it's the chief of staff. Shouldn't this screen be examined by an other body?
Challenge, Chair, is in an organization, sometimes the person at the top of the organization, I'll use not a political example. Chair of government working in the Ontario government, deputy ministers would have to have a screen because they were from private sector. An ADM would have to administer the screen, somebody reporting to the DM. It's kind of hard to have a screen in an organization when the person at the top of the organization needs a screen, but that doesn't mean the screen's not valid, and it doesn't mean the principle isn't inappropriate, as challenging as it is.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, second round, you're starting 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Levine, continuing the discussion around ethics screens, the cornerstone of the Conflict of Interest Act is transparency, and yet when it comes to the ethics screen that had been set up by the Ethics Commissioner in respect of Mr. Carney, there is complete opaqueness. There is no transparency. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm sort of loath to comment on specific screens, but I think in just my general comment that they have the potential to mask conflicts rather than to make them open. So I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. Professor Stedman, when I asked him about the ethics screen, what confidence or how would Canadians know whether it was being triggered when it ought to be in the face of Mr. Carney's multitude of conflicts of interest, he said his answer was trust and faith, nothing more. I would submit that's not good enough. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, I think there needs to be, if you're going to use screens, I'd prefer some sort of legislative scheme that said how they had to be set up. And I do take the point that if you have employees monitoring it, that's an issue.
Well, and when you say employees monitoring, here we have a screen that is being administered by the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, both of whom answer to the Prime Minister and serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. That is a conflict, is it not?
Well, potentially, yeah. It is, and it goes back to something I was thinking about before, or saying before about the blind trust. I mean, either it's working or it's not, and then you seem to have a screen to try to make sure there are no conflicts. The relationship needs to be clarified.
And would you support some level of oversight by the Ethics Commissioner, some sort of reporting mechanism? What would you recommend in that regard?
Yeah, both, actually. I think both those things. Well, the Ethics Commissioner obviously knows there are screens, but yeah, there needs to be a third party watching this.
And I would just observe that with respect to Mr. Carney's so-called ethics screen, there is no oversight by the Ethics Commissioner. There is no oversight from anyone other than the Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, both of whom are conflicted. There is no public reporting mechanism. There hasn't even been transparency around how the ethics screen is supposed to work and how decisions are made. And so I would submit that in the face of the most conflicted Prime Minister in Canadian history, Canadians deserve a whole lot better than what is nothing more than a smokescreen. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Saini, you have 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Mr. Guarino, thank you for appearing. You were Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister Harper. Was there such a thing as blind trust and screens at that time? And were you entrusted to take control of those, similar to what's happening today?
The first answer, Chair, is yes. There were blind trusts and there were screens. They existed. Mr. Harper didn't have any, so I didn't administer them. My successor had one, and it was administered by the Deputy Chief of Staff.
So Deputy Chief of Staff, who does?
Well,
he
yeah,
or
Nigel
she
Rice was
reports
administered
to?
by the Deputy Chief of Staff because Nigel was the Chief of Staff.
No, but the Deputy Chief of Staff, who did he also reported to the Prime Minister, did he not?
No, he reported to the Chief of Staff whose screen he was administering. So it's exactly in the Harper government exactly what we're talking about took place.
So what is the issue today when it wasn't the issue 15 years ago?
I don't know. I'll say this, Chair. There are three pieces to the transparency of a screen, and two are already legislated and should be happening. So first of all, the screen itself is supposed to be reported and published. And I believe I see people in this room who I believe have had their screens published. So that exists. Number two, recusals, when they happen, are supposed to be published and reported, and they're publicly available. The missing piece is when a staff member or the screen administrator screens something away so it never gets to the public office holder, there is a gap in the Act. The Act doesn't say that needs to be reported somewhere, and that could be fixed up. But the existence of screens, the Act's been around 18 and a half years, screens been around for 18 and a half years.
Thank you. You have noted that the volunteer political activity should be automatically be treated as lobbying. How can parliamentarians best draw the line between legitimate volunteer political activity and the compensated lobbying so the rules remains fair and constitutional?
Oh, I don't think Chair, I have said that. I actually believe that voluntary activity should not be treated as lobbying, and I oppose moves to expand lobbying regulation to cover things people do for free. There are jurisdictions that do regulate it, but I don't support that, and I don't advocate moving to that federally.
You have warned that merging the Office of Ethics and Lobbying Commissioner could create confusion and weaken expertise. Instead of merging, what practical coordination tools, such as joint guidance or shared definition, would best serve Canadian and strengthen each office mandate?
So exactly that, Chair. But those things could. Shared definitions could, joint guidance could, and in fact the two commissioners, Commissioner of Lobbying, the Conflict of Interest Ethics Commissioner, have collaborated. They have shared guidance on the acceptable limits for meals and hospitality. They actually work together and do try to dovetail their work. So exactly what the member has asked about, I think is a better solution than merger.
Mr. Levine, your viewpoint on that issue?
Sorry, I have nothing really to add to that.
Okay. The current act includes a 5-year post-employment lobbying ban for designated public office holder. Is the length and scope of that restriction still appropriate today? And how could it be improved to protect the integrity without discouraging qualified people from public service?
Who are you directing your question to, sir?
Mr. Guerrero,
Mr.
please.
Jarno.
Chair, I think 5 years is appropriate. I know that some people on the Hill question that, but the purpose of the ban is to ensure that people who, in the service of the Crown, for which they get paid a salary, amass a network of contacts, contacts which belong to the people of Canada because they were amassed on the taxpayer's dime, don't turn around and use those contacts to fuel their lobbying practice. So 5 years was seen as an appropriate amount of time by Parliament at the time, and I think that that's the case. I know that many people end up in lobbying, and it's a valid profession, it's a lawful profession, it's a helpful profession. It actually is important to development of public policy, but I would hope that nobody goes into government hoping to come out lobbying, and if that's the sort of person who is affected by 5 years, then I'm not sure that is a public policy problem.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jarno. Mr. Sané, Monsieur Thériault pour 5 minutes.
Mr. Thériault, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Levine, quickly, on the subject of screens, once a public office holder makes a declaration to the Ethics Commissioner, and the Ethics Commissioner determines that it's appropriate to have conflict of interest screens, this is the concrete manifestation of the fact that we are in a conflict of interest, potential conflict of interest situation, correct?
Yes.
OK. Est-ce que, à ce moment-là,
In that case, is it possible to find a way for those screens to be transparent? You know, what are they actually? And then how could there be some other body reviewing the fact that this filter or screen is being respected? Because right now, you see that it's being managed by a chief of staff. It would be very hard for me, to have a prime minister recuse himself and come back to a decision that everybody else would have reversed. I mean, I really wonder how feasible that would be.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure about the example. I just come back to, it's been said that the screens have worked for a long time. I don't necessarily refute that. I just think it needs to be clearer how they operate. And I think you're right about who it is monitoring them. So why isn't the commissioner monitoring the whole process? And why isn't there more reporting about the decisions actually taken? So that's...
en réponse à une de mes questions,
As an answer to one of my questions, the commissioner said that there would be a conflict of interest if he were to examine the screen.
Is that why?
Oui, on pourrait toujours.
Yes. We could prevent him from being both a party and a judge, but there has to be some sort of review of the process and accountability. What do you think?
Well, that's true. You could argue there's an institutional bias. But if you're talking about screening walls and walls of separation, there's no reason he couldn't have a separate process within his office that would wall him off from that problem of making two decisions on the same matter.
Croyez-vous qu'il faudrait...
Do you believe that we should improve the definition of conflict of interest so that it could cover something other than strictly personal interest, but also cover general matters?
Well, you do use the term private interests, and the reason I commented on that was I had listened to some earlier testimony which said that the only interests that mattered were financial. And I don't think that's right. And I think it's good that the Act talks about private interest. So I would leave that, actually. Private interest is the thing to look at because that encompasses both financial and other types of relational interests that may come into play.
Mais actuellement,
And right now, and this is what the Ethics Commissioner said to us, once you have a situation of conflict of interest, and if it's general, and it's not simply the individual themselves who's benefiting or one of the members of their family, at that point, it's fine? Is that why Mr. Luckner was saying 99% of the Act would imply that the PM doesn't have to recuse himself?
Yeah, that actually is the common law. That actually embodies what the common law was. It's saying that there's an interest in common with the electors or the citizens or the people, at large. And it's not that you don't have a conflict of interest. It's that the conflict of interest then is so broad that you have the interest of all the people. That's essentially what it's saying.
Okay.
And that's not an uncommon exemption. If you look through most of the legislation in the country, you will see the same thing.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Levine. Merci, Monsieur Thériault. Mr. Majumdar, you have 5 minutes, followed by sharing of time, Madame Lapointe and Ms. Church, and then we are going to have 2.5 minutes if anybody wants to finish up. So think about that. Go ahead, Mr. Majumdar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Giorno, let me thank you for your service. I was a public office holder for a time when we overlapped. And I wanted to ask you first a little bit about the difference between consequences and accountability. Your testimony described how there's not much accountability beyond public embarrassment or shame if people contravene the act, except for minor infractions. Is that right?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that the act was intentionally developed by people who thought that that was okay.
Right. I recall, though, that there was another layer of accountability that came straight from the top during the Harper government, meaning your contribution to ensuring that public office holders, members of parliament, cabinet members were held to a higher standard by your office, the Prime Minister's office. Does that seem a fair representation, knowing what the Act had and the standards you'd held for the government?
Well, thanks, Chair. The answer is yes, and I thank the member for saying that. I think I tried to do that, but I don't think that was a substitute for the deficiencies in the Act. But yes, we tried to be very vigilant about this and very firm about these things.
Yeah, it comes from the top. And I'm asking that question because it speaks to the nature of the kind of leadership we have and the potential conflict that they're in. Just to be clear, and I know this might seem a bit repetitive, the Conflict of Interest Act clearly applies to the Prime Minister. He's not above that in any way, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Of its 55 rules, 40 carry no actual penalty if broken.
That is correct.
So if the Prime Minister, if Mark Carney breached the most serious conflict rules, there would be no fine, no charge, no penalty.
That is correct. There would be, in theory, a potential report by the Commissioner that was made public.
A report. Sections 8 and 9 forbid using public office to further personal interests if Mr. Carney's decisions benefited assets he knows about placed under those so-called blind trust, in this so-called blind trust. That would qualify under those sections, right?
I wouldn't want to go that far because those are what the sections say for sure, Chair. Those are what the sections say, but I would hesitate to apply facts to law not knowing all the facts. But those are certainly sections that would come into play. But I'd defer to the Commissioner's interpretation of how they apply to those facts.
The facts can be murky because if his assets remain undisclosed, there's no way for Canadians to even know if a conflict exists, right?
Yes, but the Commissioner knows his assets. The Commissioner knows all assets in blind trusts and not in blind trusts.
Right. And so if Mr. Carney was meeting with money managers in places like New York and elsewhere, knowing what constitutes what assets he may have held in the blind trust before it went into blind trust, there's really no appreciation for to what degree he's making decisions, promoting specific deals that would benefit his own portfolio holdings. There's no transparency around that, right?
There is no public transparency. The Commissioner does have the tools to deal with that. Whether the Commissioner has the resources to deal with that's another story, but certainly the Commissioner should know what's in blind trusts, and the Commissioner should know what's in personal assets not in blind trusts.
Okay. And Section 21 requires recusal from any matter where there is a conflict.
Yes.
And if Mr. Carney makes policy decisions that affect his own undisclosed investments, there's technically no enforceable consequence. Is that fair?
That is correct. There's also a requirement to disclose the recusals under Section 25, but that's correct. There are no penalties for not doing either.
But incentives for the decisions that he might make. So Mr. Carney could control the country's economic agenda while personally benefiting from the tune of tens of millions of dollars, and Canadians may not even know about what kind of benefit he's deriving from the decisions he's making.
Some of those facts I'm not aware of, but it is true that these things are known only to the public office holders and the commissioner, except for what is disclosed on the public registry.
Would you agree then if that this loophole allows the appearance, if not the reality, but perhaps the reality even, of serious conflicts of interest from the Prime Minister as it's established today?
Chair, I'm not sure which loophole the member is referring to. I think there are many.
Well, that would be great for you to enumerate the many.
In as short a time as possible.
Well, the absence of penalties is one of them, obviously. I think that's the largest. The fact that divestment is defined to include not divestment is another. But the reality is that the Commissioner does know more than we know. So the way the Act should work is the Commissioner and the reporting public office holder should have equal knowledge of what is going on, and the Commissioner should be there and has the power to initiate without even a complaint where there's a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Giorno. Mr. Majumdar. Madame Lapointe et Madame Church, partagez.
Ms. Lapointe and Ms. Church, you're sharing your time. Ms. Church, go ahead.
Let me maybe just pick up on that. Mr. Giorno, so is a public office holder restricted in the instructions provided to a trustee, that in the instructions that they may provide to a trustee in a blind trust?
Yes, there are restrictions. There can be general guidance given, but not specific restrictions related to the active management of the trust. That it's going to be blind.
What would the purpose of that be?
What would the purpose?
What would the purpose of limiting the public office holder's ability to issue instructions be?
The purpose would be to ensure the trust is blind, and that there's a separation between what's happening inside the trust and what the public office holder is aware of. Reporting public office holder, is aware of.
Mm-hmm. And is a trustee under any obligation to accept guidance from a public office holder?
No, quite the contrary. The trustee can't accept guidance, and that which we said in the trust instrument, the Act provides what it's to say, and the Commissioner will not approve an instrument setting up the trust if it doesn't provide for the proper separation between the reporting public office holder and the trustee.
Mm-hmm. And what, if any, constraints exist on the information that's provided to a public office holder about the composition or the performance of any assets in a blind trust?
The only thing that the reporting public office holder who has assets in a blind trust is entitled to receive are reports on the total valuation, and there's a section of the Act that says any other information that's needed for legal requirements. So anything that the public officer may have to file, the trustee is able to tell the RPOH that. That's it.
So once a blind trust is established or is in the process of being established, if I understand you correctly, the person establishing that blind trust has almost no ability to provide instructions to the trustee on how that trust should be managed. And in fact, the Commissioner would step in if such instruction was given.
Yes, it should step in, yes.
Should step in?
Yes.
That a trustee is actually bound not to accept guidance on the composition of the trust once it's established. They have an obligation to maintain the trust independently, blindly, and that there are strict constraints limiting any information on the performance and composition of the trust once it's operational.
Yes, all those things are correct, and the trustee is it can't be like your brother-in-law or sister-in-law. It's got to be somebody who's in the business of doing this, a financial institution or an individual who manages assets for a living, and the Commissioner will also have a say on that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Giorno.
Bonjour à vous deux. Bienvenue. Alors,
Hello to both of you, and welcome. I have a question for you. In the 2024-2025 annual report of the Ethics Conflict of Interest Commissioner, there was a proposal to broaden explicitly the scope of the conflict of interest legislation for apparent conflict of interest by amending Section 5 as follows. The public office holder must manage private affairs so as to avoid being in a final conflict of interest situation or an apparent conflict of interest situation. Do you agree with this proposal? And if so, why?
that way. But in general, I do believe that it is appropriate to add a perception or appearance standard, because I believe that it's appropriate to have the commissioner deal with situations where a reasonable person, knowing all the facts, would perceive that such a situation existed, for public confidence reasons.
Yeah.
Selon vous, élargir l'application de la loi.
And so extending the Act definition to the appearance of conflict of interest, does this make it harder to apply or easier to apply?
Harder to apply, yes.
OK. J'ai une question que j'ai posée.
There's a question I've asked other witnesses. If you had to compare yourself to other conflict of interest acts in other provinces, territories in Canada or other countries, which would you look to as a model, and which would you suggest that we look at?
So I don't know what Mr. Levine will say on this, Chair, but my answer is, and I've said this before, I'm not just saying this here for the first time, I've said before, I actually believe that the Federal Conflict of Interest Act is among the gold standards. There are, by my count, 5 different ways of defining conflict of interest. This Act uses an opportunity-based test, which I think is one of the best. I believe even within the federal public sector, last point I'll make is that the federal public sector doesn't use the same definition as this Act. The policy on people management, the directive on conflict of interest, established by Treasury Board, use, in my view, an inferior definition to this one. I actually think this Act is the gold standard. And when I go to other places, municipalities, I'm a municipal integrity commissioner, I point to this definition as one of the leading definitions.
Okay, thank you. Merci, Madame
May I
Lapointe.
say something?
Mr. Yeah, if it's quick, Mr. Levine, please add something to the discussion, because I've got 2 more rounds.
Okay, well, I won't belabor it, but I would go to the BC Act if you're dealing with apparent conflict of interest. And in some ways, the Members' Integrity Act of Ontario, the formulation is better than the federal.
Yeah, both
not on apparent, but on conflict of interest generally.
Yeah, we've heard consistently both Ontario and British Columbia, and we've also heard Quebec as well. So, Mr. Cooper for 2.5, followed by Ms. Church, I believe. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would at this time like to move a motion, but I put on notice on October the 1st.
Go ahead.
And the motion calls upon the Prime Minister to come clean and disclose exactly who he met with and who they represented and the particulars of what was discussed when the Prime Minister met in New York City and in London, England, with leading global investment leaders. Since the motion was put on notice, the Prime Minister has disclosed the names of who he met with, and frankly, based upon those names, it raises even more questions.
Just hang on. So just before we move forward, for any discussion on this, the motion, as you said, was on notice, so it's in order. And I'll give you the floor. I think perhaps at this point I may dismiss Mr. Giorno and Mr. Levine because we are almost near the time where we need it to be. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your testimony. It was very, very helpful today, your expertise on this issue. And on behalf of the committee and on behalf of Canadians, I want to thank you for that. Okay? So, thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you. And the committee members are saying thank you, Mr. Levine, in case you can't hear them. So, thanks again. Mr. Barrett, on the motion?
Cooper.
Sorry, Mr. Cooper on the motion. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, the ethics screen, the Prime Minister's so-called ethics screen, covers Brookfield in light of the Prime Minister's very real conflicts of interest due to his connections to Brookfield, including his future bonus pay worth tens of millions of dollars.
Sorry to interrupt again, Mr. Cooper, but I don't believe you read the entire text of the motion,
Okay.
so I need you to do that. Put
Okay.
it on record. I know
Okay.
it's on notice, but I need you to put it on record
Okay.
before you continue.
Okay. So the motion reads as follows, that having regard for the fact that the Prime Minister met with several business as well as investment leaders in his recent trips to New York City, New York, and London, England, and the Prime Minister has refused to disclose which individuals and/or entities he met with during those trips, and is subject pursuant of Conflict of Interest Act to an ethics screen intended to prevent him from making decisions related to 100 free companies that would place him in a conflict of interest, the committee order from the Prime Minister's office the production of records which comprehensively list each individual and, if applicable, the name of which entity, corporation, organization, and/or agency they represented, and their job title that was present in a meeting with the Prime Minister, the time and date at which those meetings took place, and what was discussed in those meetings from and including September 21, 2025 to and including September 28, 2025, and that these records be deposited with the clerk of the committee in both official languages no later than 1 week following the adoption of this motion. So that is the motion. And, Mr. Chair, this motion is about transparency. It's about seeing whether, in fact, the Prime Minister's so-called ethics screen is, in fact, working. The Prime Minister met with top global investment leaders in New York and in London. They were secret meetings. When he was asked who he met with, he refused to say. This motion was put on notice. Subsequent to that, the Prime Minister disclosed the names of the individuals that he met with. And based upon that limited disclosure, frankly, it raises more questions than it provides in the way of answers, because among those companies or representatives of companies that he met with have ties to none other than Brookfield. Now, the Prime Minister's ethics screen covers Brookfield because of the very real conflicts of interest that he has arising from the time that he was CEO of Brookfield Asset Management. But there we have the Prime Minister meeting in secret in New York and in London with global investment leaders with ties to Brookfield. And I would cite, for example...
J'ai un point d'ordre, s'il vous plaît, Monsieur le Président, parce que je veux juste comprendre...
Point of order. I'd just like to understand where my colleague is going with this. Is he amending a motion? Is he tabling a different motion? Is this a notice of motion? I think he's debated the motion. I'd just like to know where he's going with this. What agenda are we dealing with? If he is tabling a notice of motion, I think that's one thing. If he's amending the motion, then that he's. I'd just like to know exactly what the position is here.
The motion was put on notice October 1st? October 1st? So Mr. Cooper has moved the motion now that was on notice, and it was distributed to all members. Every member has a copy of that notice and that motion. So he properly moved the motion just now, and he's speaking to the motion. He has the floor. So if anybody, and Ms. Lapointe is afterwards. So everything is in order here. So.
Si je comprends bien, il est en train de s'exprimer sur le dépôt.
So if I understood correctly, we're on the tabling of the motion now?
Thank you. Yeah. Mr. Saini, are you on a point of order?
On a matter of privilege. The meeting, I have another commitment.
Well,
we are supposed to finish at... No.
It doesn't work that way.
6:30, and
yeah.
I don't think we can carry on.
Well, until this is disposed of, or we run out of resources, this will be debated. And I'm sorry that you have a meeting, but I would suggest that you speak to your whip, and maybe have somebody come in and fill in for you, sir. Okay. So, Mr. Cooper, you still have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a Prime Minister who met in secret with companies or representatives of companies with ties to Brookfield, global investment leaders like Bill Gates of Microsoft. Microsoft has an offshore agreement with Brookfield in respect of green power. Google, a large agreement with Brookfield on green energy. And of course, we know the Prime Minister co-led efforts to raise tens of billions of dollars of capital for two of the largest green energy funds in the world, the Global Transition Funds, in which he is entitled to carried interest pay, aka bonus pay, in respect of the performance of those funds. So it's not good enough to provide the names. We need to know exactly what was discussed. Canadians deserve to know whether the Prime Minister in any way tried to advance his interests or Brookfield's interests, which would advance his personal interests. This motion is about transparency. It's about providing those answers. If the Prime Minister has nothing to hide and in fact he didn't advance his personal interests, that he acted fully ethically, the Prime Minister's office would be very happy to provide those details, and Liberal MPs across the way would be voting for this motion with enthusiasm. I await to see what they do.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Sur la motion, Madame Lapointe.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le
Madame
Président.
Lapointe, on the motion. Thank you, Chair. This is something that's already public. The media has already discussed this. There is no secret here. Mr. Cooper has already said that this was public, so I don't understand why he wants to recall the motion that he had already given the notice last Wednesday. I don't understand why he's bringing it back. It's all public. All he wants to know is already in the media.
Ms. Church on the motion.
Well, Mr. Chair, I think if we are being honest with ourselves here, this motion is about grandstanding at this point in time, that the motion to basically have more information about the super secret meetings that have been disclosed and the people that the Prime Minister met with that are public knowledge and on the public record now. This doesn't seem to be a particularly good use of the committee's time. But the one thing that I would say to the members opposite proposing this is actually maybe a word of thanks to the member for explaining to all of us and to our, I'm sure, our audience here at the committee the extent of this Prime Minister's expertise in helping build private sector investments and relations across the world with some of the strongest economic and corporate actors in global markets today, at a time when the members opposite, I think, spent much of our question period talking about the importance of investment in the Canadian economy. I think that it's actually reassuring to see a government that is focused on trying to ensure that Canada remains top of mind for some of the world's largest investors, and ensuring that they understand directly from a high office like the Prime Minister, like the Prime Minister's office, the value of investing and contributing to growth in Canada. Nonetheless, despite my views on that matter, I still do think that for the committee's time here, the fact that these meetings have already been disclosed, the fact that we have lists in front of us of the people that the Prime Minister met with, I think it should be within the prerogative of this committee to focus on work that will advance our understanding of access to information and ethics rather than the grandstanding that we're seeing here.
Okay, Monsieur Sarret, sur la motion, s'il vous plaît.
Oui,
Mr. Sarret on the motion. Well, I think that all kinds of things have been said by my colleagues, Honourable Member Church. And I think, again, the purpose of this committee is to assure ethics and access to information. There was a request made on October the 1st and calling for transparency. about a particular person who was the Prime Minister, and the information has been obtained, which demonstrates the transparency of our Prime Minister, but also, as Member Church has said so eloquently, our Prime Minister is diversifying our ability, our economic ability, and is meeting with business personalities to increase our investments, whether it be sectoral or whether it's national, international. And instead of congratulating him for this exceptional effort, the Prime Minister is being told, oh, give us a report about the meetings and give us more transparency. Is this the role or the purpose of this committee? Is this the avowed purpose of this committee? Is that what we want? Do we want to know whether did you have coffee with this person or that person? Did you write notes? Give us the notes. I think that we are wasting our time here because this is an attempt to, this is about short, medium, and long-term structuring to ensure that MPs' work is such that we don't get tangled up in this kind of conversation. Now, I'm ready to stay here till midnight. No problem with that. But what is the objective here? If the objective is to discuss this so that we, as members of Parliament, can have a better access to information structure, because at 6:30 p.m., bringing this up, what is that demonstrating? Is this the way we're going to be working during this mandate? I don't think this is going to be efficient or effective. I don't think it gives anything to the taxpayers listening to us. And unfortunately, I think it's really a pity. But as I've done at the beginning, I'd like to close with this. I would like to congratulate our Prime Minister for his work and for having these meetings, because this is dealing with everything that we've heard in the question period today. He's working hard to have a strong economy and a strong Canada. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Thériault. Well, Chair, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Cooper for not tabling his motion before the time at which he tabled it. Because in the past, notices of motion were made before the meeting, and then there would be debates during the meeting while the witnesses were there, and we weren't able to hear the witnesses. So out of respect for the witnesses, I think it was good to proceed this way. Now, the notice of motion should have gone over to the Liberals, or must have gone over, fine. It would have been a good idea for the Prime Minister's office, out of respect for this committee, to have not just sent the information to journalists, but also sent everything requested in the motion to the committee. That would have been a mark of respect, because we're not doing politics here. We are involved in ethics here. And the reaction of my colleagues across the table leads me to believe that they're here to defend their leader. I have nothing to do with that. I didn't come here for that. What I want is transparency, and more transparency in this unusual case that we have before us. Everybody has agreed that the current situation involving our Prime Minister holding the highest rank in the country is a situation which had not been anticipated when the conflict of interest legislation was drafted, and it was not foreseen during the more recent revisions of this legislation. So, if colleagues are in good faith, well, they shouldn't be objecting to having increased transparency regarding the work that is supposed to be done for the common good, done by this Prime Minister, and that's why I'll be voting in favor of the motion. Thank you, Mr. Thériault. Mr. Saini, go ahead.
But I thought that we were here to better the ethic legislation. What I see happening here is my colleagues on the other side have nothing more than to attack the current Prime Minister, who was elected by Canadians, knowing fully well what he was doing compared to the leader of the opposition, who even couldn't hold his own seat. And this is a sad, sad situation that we are just talking about one person. This is not the Ethics Committee's role. And I'm sad this is where we are heading.
Sayani, I think I have Mr. Barrett on the motion.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt the member opposite's dinner plans, Chair. I think this is an important matter. We have, as Mr. Cooper articulated, a situation that's extraordinary, and we can go back several months to lay out the situation that Canadians are facing. And I would hearken members back to one of the debates during the election, where the Prime Minister, the former chair of Brookfield Asset Management, which is a major shareholder in Westinghouse Nuclear, said from the debate stage that Westinghouse, by name, was the preferred option of a government that he would lead. Why on earth would that have been the Prime Minister's choice? Now, this, of course, is the same Prime Minister who, before there was any type of ethics screen in place, before there were disclosures made to the public or finalized reports to the Commissioner, was sitting at the Cabinet table in March. But it's also the same Prime Minister who said that he himself wrote the Liberals' election platform. Well, that's before any of these screens were being administered or in place, and before the disclosures were made public. So people are rightly concerned that this Prime Minister has not been acting in their best interests. And this list of companies or individuals that were disclosed, we don't know if it's the full list, and it wasn't proactively disclosed. If I'm not mistaken, it was only released after media questions and after Mr. Cooper moved the motion at committee. So this is a matter where we're dragging, kicking and screaming a Prime Minister. And look, this isn't my first day. I've been here for a few years, and just the existence of the rules has not been demonstrated to be enough for Liberal ministers and Liberal Prime Ministers to follow them. Justin Trudeau was a serial ethical lawbreaker, time and time again. And ministers in his cabinet, some of those ministers who broke ethics laws are still in the Liberal cabinet. So you'll have to excuse us if we just can't say, my goodness, this is so unbelievable. The Conservatives are doing politics here, and they're just not taking the Right Honourable Prime Minister at his word.
Why would we?
We haven't been given any reason to. Unfortunately, we have to force disclosure from the Prime Minister. So tell us, give us the information. Disclose the information so that we can get on with it. But I just think it's unreasonable at best to just simply say, well, this is not something that we would ask for here, because the only reason the information that we have exists in the public forum is because we moved a motion at this committee. But we can backslap and congratulate ourselves on what a great job everybody's doing instead of just addressing the matter at hand. But that's not providing the accountability and transparency to Canadians in the context of a study that's about strengthening Canadians' confidence in elected officials and in our public institutions. I think that everyone should see. You know, we hear the refrain from the government very often that they're a new government. Well, the only reason that there's been a branding change is because of the conduct of the old government. It's the same. The same people are still there, but we saw what happened before, and as some of our witnesses testified today, the absence of meaningful penalties meant that people treat it just like a speeding ticket. That's no problem. I'm in a hurry. We're going to move fast and break stuff. Well, that's not the integrity that Canadians expect from elected officials. That's exactly what undermines confidence in our public institutions. And time again, and we saw it. We saw it in the last Parliament. We saw it over the last decade, where in this very committee room, we would have members opposite say, you know, this is just politics and there's nothing to see here. And what did we find out? We found out that we were right. And when we said that there were contracting, what we believed would be contracting irregularities, and that there was insider dealing on things like the $60 million Arrive scam, that is exactly what we found. That's exactly what we found. But we were told, do not investigate this. You're calling into question the good work of honest public servants. Nope. We were calling into question grifting done by people who are adding no value to products that Canadian taxpayers were paying for but could ill afford and provided no real safety or service to them. But we were told, don't ask the question. This is just politics that you're doing. No, the House passed motions to recuperate, to recover that money, because those were ill-gotten gains. We have a real opportunity here to actually refurbish the confidence that Canadians have in their public institutions and public office holders. That is actually something that we're able to do. We're not going to be scared off by just the mere suggestion that we should be delighted that the Prime Minister ran for office. And we're not going to simply accept that because he says it, so it is. Trust, it has to be earned. And if this was, in fact, a new government, we would not see ministers who broke the very law that we are reviewing at this committee in the federal cabinet today. So there hasn't been that kind of repair done to the reputation of the government. And so we're going to demand accountability, especially in the context of the law that we're reviewing. We saw from the time that Mr. Carney started as an advisor to Mr. Trudeau, decisions being taken by the Liberal government that align directly with the investments and financial interests of Mr. Carney and the company that he represented. I think about decisions on heat pumps and Brookfield's investment in Train. I think about mortgage rule changes. Well, Brookfield is the owner of the second largest private mortgage insurer, if I'm not mistaken. Time and time again, and Mr. Carney, we saw what happened when he was in the UK with exactly the same kind of heat pump scheme being peddled by the government there in response to a request that benefited him. The heat pump hustle is a perfect example of why we just can't take him at his word. It's about the integrity of the system that we have here. And we saw, and I don't need to relitigate the issues of Mr. Trudeau. But Mr. Carney seems to be accumulating his own at such a speed that if we don't slow down and take a look at some of these, like, for example, this list not being furnished to this committee. He didn't send it to us, but he knew the motion was passed. He's got a real big staff. Was not furnished to this committee as evidence for our consideration or as a response to Mr. Cooper, being proactive, being open. This is an opportunity that they passed up, that Mr. Carney passed up. Why? If this isn't about politics, and if he's just focused on doing a great job.
No one believes that.
Unfortunately, it's impossible to believe because of the decisions that he's taken to this point. And so we're left to ask for the receipts. Show us who was there. We need to know. And some of the questions that we've examined today about how we can improve on the act that we have so that we can know who knows what. When is the screen being triggered? What decisions has he recused himself from? We don't know. And so, again, we're left to take him at his word. The question about tax havens today isn't something that was just conjured out of thin air. It's because we know that Mr. Carney put together funds in his role as chair at Brookfield Asset Management that were in tax havens. So I can't believe that this is someone who's altruistic and, solely focused on what's in the best interest of Canada when he thought, what would be best for us is what's best for Bermuda. Let's headquarter this business down there above a bike shop and make sure we're not paying our fair share of taxes in Canada. That doesn't sound like someone who's got that level of focus. And so we have to press and we have to ask the tough questions. And it should be pretty up and down. I mean, a vote on something like this. You would think that it could pass, but again, I've been here for a minute and I've seen filibusters start to move from the back burner to the front burner, and I can't sit here while we just cycle through speaker after speaker who just want to say how everything's great and we should just let things slide. Take him at his word. Well, I don't take him at his word. I would like to see the receipts, as we said. If this was a good faith exercise from the Prime Minister's office, they would have furnished it to the committee. They did not. We're asking for the rest of the information. It's not too much to ask. It's actually the least that they can provide to Canadians. And so if the conversation has to continue, we can continue it. But it's about improving. It's about improving the safeguards, improving the shields, so that Canadians can have confidence in elected officials. They can have confidence in Parliament.
Ms. Church, on the motion.
Well, Mr. Chair, my colleague, the member opposite, talks a lot about trust in institutions. But I would argue to this committee that what we're actually witnessing is an undermining of the trust in our institutions. The law is an institution in this country. There is an ethics regime under the law. It exists. The Ethics Commissioner oversees this regime. Mr. Chair, we've just spent 2 hours listening to witnesses who have talked to us about the strictures of that framework that exists and that has been in place here for decades. And so when I hear the members opposite talk highly about maintaining trust in institutions, about their concern over how the ethics framework is applied. I think about this committee's role and about a member's role usurping the function of the ethics commissioner. We heard from Mr. Giorno about half an hour ago how the ethics commissioner very deliberately has insight into the disclosures of all members that are subject to the regime. Parliament, in creating the ethics framework, has ensured that that disclosure exists, that disclosure goes to an ethics commissioner who is independent and, in fact, above the partisanship of Parliament. A partisanship which is appropriate in certain circumstances, but when it comes to personal and private interests, when it comes to the financial situation of all members of Parliament, these are communicated to the ethics commissioner to ensure that that office has full knowledge over what the situation of members actually is. With that knowledge, the ethics commissioner sets up the rules which public office holders are then bound to apply. What I'm hearing from my colleague opposite is actually an undermining of that framework, because he suggests that it is this committee's role to ensure that members go above and beyond, that in some ways they take it under their own advisement as to what are the rules that they should follow. Not the rules that are on the books, not the rules that are delineated in the law and in the Act, and the timeframes that have been established by Parliament, but that somehow there is that members must go above and beyond. It is a strange time when Conservatives consider it to be a best approach that parliamentarians are outside or above the law. Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, I should say, as a committee, I think we need to be focused on the review of the acts before us. I think that's the main prerogative of this committee, and we should direct as much of our attention, if the laws are insufficient, to fixing those laws, to changing those laws, but to not prosecuting individual cases against individual members of Parliament in this forum.
Thank you, Mr. Sarré.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais bien remercier toutes les personnes qui ont pris la parole, puis j'essaie.
I would like to thank the people who spoke, and I would like to what you're talking about, to know what you are talking about. My understanding is that, in my opinion,
harming the institutions. When we're talking about confidence, I think that dealing with the issue of confidence in a party, if you don't want to play politics, well, look, my question about the commission of a House of Commons, of a member of Parliament, it's still something that's initiated by the will of citizens. Chair, there was a choice. Citizens made a choice. Let's talk about trust. Trust has been given less than 6 months ago. That's number one. Number two, I think there are people here who have experience on the other side. I have no doubt about that. But there are commissioners who have come here who are telling us that this is the role, what the role is that we're supposed to be playing in this committee. And here is the role of an MP. And this is what the current situation is involving our Prime Minister. And now you're saying, no, you're wrong. No, you were wrong about that because we have to go further because it's a strange situation. It's strange for me to see such experienced members of Parliament going off the rails this way and going beyond the role which has been conferred upon us as members of this committee. And I'll stop there. I believe that we have to focus to be able to have a report based on the mandate that we have been given. Chair, this is your role. And I am speaking to you when I say we should come out with a report. If we're going to have this conversation each time, we will not have a report that will represent the experience and the expertise that we should have here on this committee. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Sarret.
Thank you, Mr. Sarret.
Do I have consensus on this, or do we need to go to a vote? Okay, we're going to go to a vote. Madam Chair, will you take the roll, please? Thank you. Oh, sorry. 1 steamboat, 2 steamboat. No other hands. Go ahead, Madam Clerk.
The vote is on the motion moved by Mr. Cooper. Ms. Church. Opposed.
No.
Madame Lapointe. Called. Mr. Seni.
Against.
Monsieur Sari.
Contre.
Mr. Barrett.
In favor.
Mr. Cooper.
In favor.
Mr. Workington.
In favor.
Here.
Monsieur Thériault.
Oui.
Yeas 4, nays 4.
And the chair votes yes.
So yeas 5, nays 4.
Okay, the motion carries. No other business. Appreciate everybody's. Oh, I'm sorry. There is one more matter of business that we have, and that is the budget. Everybody received the information on the budget regarding the briefing session with the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, Privacy Commissioner, and then the review of the Conflict of Interest Act. Any objection to the budget, or do I have unanimous consent on the budgets? Budgets are fine. Thank you. That's it for today, everyone. Enjoy Thanksgiving with your families. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Meeting's adjourned.